Hello and welcome back. Our final presentation this afternoon comes from Bradley Smith. Bradley is Secretary of the Chichester West branch of the Prayer Book Society, as well as serving on various PBS committees. During the lockdown, he took on the huge responsibility of maintaining our website listings of prayer book services being streamed online, and this brought him into contact with churches and clergy all around the country that were using and being sustained by the Book of Common Prayer during these challenging times. For anyone who isn't yet aware, you may also like to know that I will be proposing Bradley as my successor as chairman of the Prayer Book Society at the next annual general meeting. So you'll soon be seeing a lot more of him and a lot less of me. For now, though, he is introducing a session on comfortable words for troubled times, the use of the prayer book during the coronavirus pandemic. Over to you, Bradley.
Thank you very much indeed, Prudence, for your introduction and for inviting me to speak today about some of the ways, and it's only a few of the ways, in which the Book of Common Prayer has been used over recent months. We've heard today of history, we've heard about theology, and now in a different focus, I'm going to look at very simply how the prayer book has been used during this present and ongoing pandemic. I'm going to share with you some of the really positive and encouraging stories of re-engagement with and rediscovery of the prayer book that are emerging from parishes and from other settings all over the country. How the Book of Common Prayer has sustained the life of faith of individuals, of families, of communities, when gathered worship and the sacramental life were put on hold. And how the prayer book has been more widely embraced by people of all ages, of all backgrounds, and of all church traditions during these difficult and painful days. I'll be using in this presentation testimonies from clergy and laity in a variety of settings where the prayer book has been used in fresh and creative ways, where it's spoken clearly and authoritatively to our present situation, and where it's proved to be a huge blessing to so many people. I'm going to try to identify those areas of renewal and growth, both numerical and spiritual, emerging in the wake of the pandemic, which give me real hope and confidence that the Book of Common Prayer can and must be central to the revival of the life of the Church in this nation. So I've taken for my title some words slightly adapted that were left in the comments box on my parish YouTube channel from a member of the congregation who regularly watched our prayer book services online during the lockdown. Comfortable words indeed for troubled times. I remember vividly my own feeling of complete devastation when on March the 17th this year, the announcement was made by the Archbishops of Canterbury and York that public worship in churches across our country was to be suspended with immediate effect. It should have been obvious the way it was going, but it still came as a shock to so many of us. At that stage, it was still permissible, indeed, it was encouraged for the clergy to continue their pattern of daily prayer and Sunday worship from within their church buildings, but those acts of worship should happen behind closed doors. The people of God would be locked out of God's house. They wouldn't be permitted to attend public worship, though the buildings would remain open for a time for private prayer. The church was changing, we heard, whether we liked it or not, and clergy would need to find fresh and creative ways of offering worship and pastoral care, and of offering some hope to their communities under rapidly changing circumstances. The Prayer Book Society is enormously grateful to those clergy and their families, to lay ministers, musicians and others who've gone the extra mile to find new ways for the comfortable words, the authoritative words, and the hope-filled words of the Book of Common Prayer that had spoken to all sorts and conditions of men in the past, to speak with fresh clarity and wisdom at a time of utter confusion, chaos, and fear, the like of which none of us had ever experienced before. We're going to hear now about how the prayer book has been used during the lockdown and since in the parishes of East Blatchington and Bishopstone in the Diocese of Chichester. And we're going to hear from the rector, the Reverend Darwin Fuchs.
There was a recent scene in a television programme called Gentleman Jack, where the 19th century characters go to church to receive Holy Communion together. And I was struck in that scene by the continuity between the liturgy that they shared, word for word the liturgy that I also share with my congregations each Sunday at 8 o'clock and again in the evening at 6 o'clock. It is clear to everyone that we had been cast into a new normal without any prior notice in March of this year. The trauma of locking the church doors, the challenge of being forced in front of a camera, and the heartless echo of no longer seeing a congregation in person were significant. As I led those online services of Holy Communion from the Book of Common Prayer, I became newly aware of the way in which those words had navigated societies and church communities through multiple other historic and turbulent periods in history. Those words, unchanged, carefully and beautifully balanced in both rhythm and poetry, thoughtfully crafted to balance the paradox of human diversity and unity, with their unapologetic pointing towards the ever grace of God and the frailty of man, seemed to hold a new importance and place in the world. I was amazed at how apposite the words, "receive in your hearts by faith with thanksgiving," were for a congregation who couldn't receive in the palm of their hand. And the liturgy spoke into a new normal way, in a way which was nothing short of incredible. "We do not presume to come to your table," seemed to speak afresh into the absence of a ritual that we had perhaps come to take for granted. Somehow the otherness of the language offers a transcendence through time that points us towards eternity. It lifts us out of any modern slump or enlightened ennui and brings us back, turns us back even, to the Lord your God. But in these unprecedented and yet hugely historical chapters, this season that we have lived through, the prayer book has come into its own. It is a work of literary and ecclesial genius that stands not just the test of time, but arguably the test of eternity. And in the limited tools I had available to me in March and have been able to draw upon in these last few months, the Book of Common Prayer, with its hugely important literary genius, with its beautiful words and phrasing, with its echoes of the history that it has held before us and the histories it will hold after us, cannot be underestimated.
Arwen's a great ambassador for the Book of Common Prayer tradition in the Diocese of Chichester, and she's spoken to me privately about how she uses the prayer book also in the domestic setting with her family. In Arwen's parish churches, there's been a very long-standing tradition of prayer book worship that's really taken on a new lease of life as a result of the lockdown and since. In the church where I worship, we've rediscovered the Book of Common Prayer as a community in recent years, and in fact in recent months particularly. Evensong has been a regular feature of our life together for some time, but there has been no memory at all of Eucharistic worship from the prayer book. It was our plan to remedy this and to introduce a monthly service of Holy Communion from the prayer book, but the lockdown came at the wrong, or as it may prove to be the right moment, because we weren't able to hold our first one on the Saturday morning that we'd chosen. It came as quite a disappointment to us because we've been preparing people for a different experience of worship for a different language, for a different structure, and for a different content to that which would be familiar to the majority of our people. So our first celebration wasn't to take place in the way we'd originally planned. Instead, we decided to do it online. Our first celebration of BCP Holy Communion in the church for many, many years, with no one present but the priest and his wife, took place on Easter Day. And the response from our congregation and from people outside of our congregation was overwhelming. Some of our older regular worshippers told us that they'd reconnected with a liturgy that they'd known and loved in the past, the words of which had embedded themselves in deep and surprising ways. I sit at my dining room table with my iPad and earphones, and it's just me and God, said one of our older worshippers. The words come flooding back to me, like it was only yesterday that I last said them. And also, very excitingly, some of our younger worshippers and others who've come to faith in more recent years have experienced that traditional form of worship for the first time and loved and appreciated it. Having now returned to our church building as a community, we're not holding that Saturday morning Holy Communion on the third Saturday. We're running two principal morning services every Sunday, the traditional prayer book service at 9:30 and a modern rite celebration in a more Anglo-Catholic style at 11:15. Some of our worshippers have chosen their preferred service, and others split themselves between the two. But what's really interesting is that the traditional BCP liturgy is appealing to our younger worshippers. When I asked a 15-year-old member of our BCP congregation for his thoughts on the different style, he said this to me on Messenger the other day. I've been attending a different style of service, which is conducted according to the Book of Common Prayer, 1662. There are many noticeable differences between this service and the later one that I used to attend. The creed is different. There are longer prayers, more frequent responses, but the language is the biggest difference. To me, the words of the prayer book service have deeper meaning, and I like to spend some time afterwards thinking about what the passages mean. And so when I probed that young man about his feelings on the traditional language, I asked him, "Are you sure using traditional language isn't a barrier?" And he was very clear and firm in his response. No, because if you don't understand, you go and find out. We don't need to insult young people by telling them what they want and what they can and what they can't understand or appreciate. Young people can be captivated and enriched by something that's different, something that speaks to them of the holiness of God. Let us give young people spiritual food that will give them a foundation for adult discipleship. And hear a second testimony now. It's from Father Oliver Koss, who's the vicar of All Saints Northampton. He's going to tell us how the daily offering of evensong in a new way online has held together his church community and how it's been particularly important in keeping the children of the church connected with the life of faith. We listen to Oliver Koss.
Endings are often vivid memories, and I think we all have a remembrance of what it was like in March this year when for the very first time we were not allowed to worship in our buildings. We weren't allowed to invite others to come in with us, and it wasn't long before we had to relocate worship entirely to spaces like this in my study in my parson's house. And I think we knew that for a long time we would be dealing with a radically different situation.
When a chorister joins here and has passed their audition, their absolute first experience they'll have here is a rehearsal up in our choir room, and at the end of every rehearsal, a musical liturgy. On Sunday morning this is a Eucharist, but during the week this is our daily sung evensong, which takes place at 6 p.m. here in the chancel.
You can't replace in-person worship with online worship. It doesn't work like that. It's an entirely different premise altogether. But I think for this time of pandemic, we were just convinced that this is the thing we were going to do to try and save our community, to try and maintain its coherence, even while so much else in the world was falling apart, and even while families were dealing with such acute trouble and challenge. And it was important for us as a Music Education Foundation to make sure that we were reaching our children and young people, and that we are making our own contribution to their well-being and to their health during an awful time.
So the biggest change in lockdown essentially was of physical space. We were no longer physically able to rehearse or to sing together. What changed very little fundamentally was the music we were making and the cycle of daily prayer that we experienced through the Book of Common Prayer and choral evensong. We moved to a system whereby we would have choral evensong over Zoom. An order of service would be shared, which contained all the music. It would be marked up with names, and our choristers would log on, and we would sing evensong, ostensibly just as we normally would here, albeit in very different circumstances.
The output has been phenomenal, right away from multi-track recordings of things that we've used in live stream worship from the rectory or from church for special occasions and for general use. The instructional videos that have made those recordings possible and that have come with every evensong, as well as preparing copies for it. And I think that has all been targeted towards how can we maintain this continuum of prayer. How can it speak even through lockdown? And how can it speak in the most powerful way? And that was to keep our young people together and singing. Through the pandemic, we've been using regularly the prayer for use in dire plague and common sickness. And I think people are often surprised to learn that the young person's first experience of worship at All Saints is through the Book of Common Prayer and through choral evensong. But I think that made it all the more important for us to use those familiar words as we gathered online to worship, not merely to continue that prayer and to ensure that it was never taken from us, but also to keep our community together and to build ever deeper roots.
So I'd like to thank Father Oliver and all involved at All Saints Northampton for that very moving video, reminding us of the beauty of Prayer Book Evensong in keeping together a community, and particularly a community of children and their families. One of the really striking and exciting things that I've seen coming out of the lockdown and as we return to our churches is the rediscovery of the prayer book offices by people of all ages, the development of apps and of other means of accessing the offices and taking part in them, not least by live streaming on Facebook, has been really significant. And we'll hear about one of them towards the end of this presentation that's attracting many, many young people. And it's encouraging to note too, I say as a bookseller, that lots of people have discovered the book itself. Many people are buying copies of the Book of Common Prayer. My colleague and I have never sold so many as we have been doing recently since we reopened the business after the lockdown. I think many people have found spiritual strength in this extended Eucharistic fast that was forced upon us, in praying the offices in their own homes. And for some, that's been a far more valuable and enriching experience than watching services online. The BCP office has so much to recommend it. Its ease of use, it's straightforward, it can be used in the home or in the church. And as we've heard already today, it was Cranmer's intention that any man could join in those services with ease, and that they could form part of his daily life. He wouldn't need to spend his time looking for pages and alternatives, but actually praying. Variety does not necessarily mean a more prayerful experience. One of the criticisms that we hear is that young people in particular will become bored with saying the same words day after day with little variation. In actual fact, I've found from conversations I've had recently that the opposite is true. One of the wonderful things about the prayer book office is its memorability. The words repeated day in and day out have the capacity to sink deeply into the soul, so that before too long, one finds oneself not just reading prayers from a sheet, a book or an app, but actually praying them from the heart. We need to recover the concept of learning prayers by heart that can feed and nourish us in all kinds of situations of our lives. And it's really encouraging to see services of Matins and Evensong being embraced on Sundays in so many parishes. My own church is starting a weekly service of public Matins from tomorrow. And another church in the team here, St Mary's Aldingbourne, their Matins has been rediscovered during the lockdown. Congregation made up almost all of regular worshippers, plus significantly a number of others from the local community who weren't particularly connected with the church, have gathered via Zoom every Sunday of the lockdown to pray Matins. For many years, all the services at St Mary's were taken from Common Worship, and from before that from the ASB. Reverend Tony Brandt says this: "We made the decision to introduce morning prayer in its traditional form, found in the Book of Common Prayer. For some, this has reawakened the memory of a liturgy from many years ago. For others, it was a new experience. It has been received with great enthusiasm, and some local people have reconnected with the church as a result. The beauty of the language and the high level of congregational participation have been particularly appreciated. Significant outcome is that it's now our intention to introduce a regular service of Matins in the church on a Sunday. Over the weeks, we've rediscovered the beauty of the responses and the canticles of morning prayer, and this liturgy now has a new future in this place." The use of the offices in college chapels seems to be a really important way in which college communities have been held together. And there have been so many other initiatives that have been really valuable in keeping those without internet access connected with the prayer of the church. The archbishops were wrong when in the letter of the 17th of March, they said that the provision of online worship would, quote, enable the people of God and anyone and everyone who looks to God for support and meaning in this time of crisis to participate in the life of worship at home. They were wrong because not everyone has a computer, not everyone has an iPhone. Indeed, many people in our church communities cannot afford them. And churches have found wonderful ways of connecting with those people and ensuring they're not forgotten. We've heard of use of tapes of services, a fantastic daily prayer bulletin that comes from St James Gaelic Hythe in the City of London, where each day a booklet's provided by email and print containing a psalm from the prayer book, scripture readings, a reflection on the readings, collects and other prayers. There are so many other creative ways in which the comfortable words of the prayer book have been heard. For instance, the Reverend Deborah Walton told us how her services have been broadcast into nursing homes, so that when she couldn't go into the homes, those there were able to participate in the worship. I've been really encouraged to see so many new prayer book services taking place in this diocese of Chichester in recent weeks since the churches began to reopen. I've given you an example of two already where Matins has made a comeback. In others, there are evensongs being advertised where previously there were none. In a few cases, there are prayer book services of the Holy Communion taking place now as the principal service, where previously they followed common worship and the prayer book, if at all, at 8 o'clock. One example that I've found especially moving is from the Diocese of Portsmouth, a totally deprived estate community, where following the resumption of public worship, the main service that takes place in that 1950s church building is now taken from the Book of Common Prayer on every Sunday morning. The reason? That contemporary forms of worship, without the addition of music and servers and so on, has been found to be bland and wanting in some respects. But with the Book of Common Prayer, there has been found depth, colour, richness, and strength. The congregation of that Anglo-Catholic parish, which includes many families and teenagers, has embraced the Book of Common Prayer, and its use is renewing the life of the local church. The prayer book is for everyone, for all traditions and in all contexts. And it can unite us across the Church of England. Common worship is anything but common. How few people own the library of common worship in their homes, and how many would know how to navigate its many options? Common prayer is just that, common prayer, and a concept we must recover for the sake of the Church of England. If the Book of Common Prayer really is to recover its place in the life of the Church of England, then it needs to be used for principal services. So I would encourage clergy to be bold in introducing the prayer book liturgy at key times of day, and not just at 8 o'clock or for evensong. And I would encourage lay people to be bold in asking for the prayer book services, perhaps even once a month at the principal time. The requests may be met with resistance, but they may be met very well received. In these days of plague and sickness, of despair, of grief, the Book of Common Prayer has come into its own by confidently and unashamedly pointing us to the person of Jesus Christ and urging us to root our confidence entirely in him. When the darkness of sickness and death around us has threatened to overwhelm us, the beauty, majesty and depth of the prayer book has reminded us that we are not in control. It's reminded us of the sovereign rule of God and of our failure to live by his standards. The prayer book brings us to our knees in sorrow for our disobedience and for the mess we have made and continue to make of the world around us. And it lifts us up in thanksgiving for God's mercy, love and protection from the perils and dangers of the night. In the midst of extreme suffering, prayer book has shown us where we might find real cause for thanksgiving. And the prayer book locates that the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross that frees us from the fear of death and indeed from the fear of life. God's inestimable love in the redemption of the world. More than any form of liturgy, the texts of the Book of Common Prayer have proven themselves to show us where true joy and freedom may be found, and we need the prayer book more than ever. Looking to the future, the creative ways that have been found in so many parishes, in chaplaincies and in other contexts, to connect people with the life of prayer and worship, and thereby that they may grow in the life of Christ, will still be valuable. They can never replace gathered church, and we must resist every suggestion that they can. But for many, the provision of online worship, from the simple dignity of evening prayer, streamed from a domestic setting, the glories of choral evensong from St Bride's Fleet Street or Grimsby Minster, from a high church choral celebration in Northampton to the quiet North End celebration in Birmingham, will be an important part of many people's spiritual development and their growth in Christ. For many of us, joining in worship from different traditions will continue to enrich our lives as it has done during the lockdown. We're going to play another video now. This is the one that's about how the daily office has been embraced by people in different contexts, but particularly by young people, and how those services of morning and evening prayer are continuing to enrich people's lives. So we hear now from Calvin Robinson, who's the founder of a website called dailyprayer.org.
This year seems to bring a whole new meaning to the season of suffering in Lent. But in Lent, of course, we were reminded that no one suffers alone and that God is with us on the cross. However, I feel this year it just felt a bit more pertinent than usual. And Easter as well, as we moved into Easter, a lot of us felt very cut off from sacramental worship, which is why on Whit Sunday I launched Daily Prayer, which was set up to provide some comfort to people who missed the comfort of praying with others during lockdown. You simply visit dailyprayer.co.uk with a computer, a mobile phone, tablet, any kind of digital device, and you can tune in to our morning prayer and evening prayer services. We read from the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, and we record sessions every morning and every evening. And we'll continue to pray morning and evening prayer even as these lockdown restrictions are lifted. Hopefully it provides some kind of comfort to strengthening one's spiritual well-being during these challenging times. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, all via dailyprayer.co.uk, or you can visit our Twitter or our Facebook. But what's remarkable to me is that in the first couple of weeks we had over 1,000 people praying with us, and we've got many more now. And these are people from all over the English-speaking world, particularly England, America, Canada, Australia, and Ireland, but also all across Europe and the rest of the world too, which is really great to see. And what's also fantastic is that most of the people praying with us are in the bracket of 18 to 22-year-olds. So this, the beauty of the prayer book is really helping young people feel connected to Christ, I think. And that's something very, very special. I would like to thank everyone for using the service, but also I'd like to thank the people who have made contributions. We've had lots of people leading morning and evening prayer all throughout lockdown, both clergy and laymen alike. And I want to say a particular thank you to Jake Scott, Zab Sansom, Alexandra Tamesko, Matthew Taylor, and the ministry team at Grimsby Minster, who have been fantastic. But also a special thank you to Father Thomas Plant, who actually planted the seed of this idea in my head at the start of lockdown. So thank you to all of those people. But if you think it's something you might find interesting, please do log on to dailyprayer.co.uk and join us. And if you'd like to make a contribution, there's a contact form on there, or you can pop me an email or tweet me at Calvin Robinson, and I'm happy to take contributions from anyone who would like to pray along with us.
I need to apologise to Calvin because I said it was dailyprayer.org. It's actually dailyprayer.co.uk. It's a wonderful initiative and just one of many where we see the offices of the prayer book, the liturgies of the prayer book, being used by so many more people. As a society, the Prayer Book Society, Our desire is not that people will encounter the Book of Common Prayer as an end in itself, but rather that people of all ages and all backgrounds may, through the living text of the prayer book, find the living Christ and in him find their life. The prayer book has given to many of us stability and hope when we most needed it. There are so many signs that people of all ages and in all contexts have indeed had their life in Christ sustained and enriched by the prayer book during these days. And now I would urge you to play your part in sharing with others in the weeks and the years ahead the beauty, the depth, and the spiritual treasure that is the Book of Common Prayer. Let us rescue the prayer book from the marginal position into which it's been forced in so many places in recent years, and let us bring it to a much wider audience, that others may through it find Christ, and in Christ find their life. Thank you very much.
And thank you again, Bradley, for that. Now, questions. There's been a lot of comments, but one actual question so far, which comes from Ian Milne again, who wants to know what you feel the Prayer Book Society could do further to support BCP prayer and praise as we go forward into the new COVID twilight, where we're neither up nor down, says Ian.
Well, we, as a society, we've established lots of new and very positive and fruitful links with parishes and with clergy, with readers, lay ministers and musicians across the country. And we need to develop those relationships and actually find out what support the parishes need. So I was talking to an incumbent in Yorkshire recently, whose parish has recently opted to become a corporate member of the Prayer Book Society. All the worship in that church is from the Book of Common Prayer. And the church needs some support and some help so that the 2030 vision can become a reality in that place in terms of growth. They're absolutely committed to maintaining the prayer book tradition, and the incumbent there, although he wasn't brought up particularly in the prayer book tradition at all, recognises that to change all the worship overnight and make it common worship or whatever doesn't make a growing church. So those places where there's a real desire to grow, we need to be engaging with them, supporting them, providing whatever resources and training we possibly can, so that that vision becomes a reality there.
Well, as I say, there have been a lot of comments from people saying how encouraged they are. Perhaps I'll just read one of them out and you can see if you have anything to add, Bradley. So this is a comment from Adrian Thomas, who said, "It's been wonderful to see how many online services have used the BCP. The BCP seems easier to use than common worship and the words are more memorable."
I think memorability is one of the greatest gifts of the prayer book. I quoted one of our parishioners earlier from my church here, who said that she didn't need to follow in a prayer book because she can just engage with language that's embedded itself so deeply into her over the years. I do have a letter from somebody who wished to thank us and to thank all the clergy who've made it possible for us to participate in online worship. Saying that in a lifetime of church going, and now she can't get to church at all, and it's very unlikely that she will ever go back to church, how the beauty and the power of that language is something that's been with her throughout her whole life. It's something that's sustained her, given her hope and a feeling of peace. And she refers specifically to the third collect at evensong, which has been particularly special to her during the lockdown and these strange days. And as far as using the Book of Common Prayer being easier, I think as someone who sets up the church and prepares for the worship, I would agree that setting up for a prayer book service is so much easier. Everything is contained in one book, and that's why it's so such a good thing that people own their own copy of the prayer book and use it as a handbook to the Christian life. as a manual for their own private devotions, as well as for the public worship of the church. It's really important that people have their own copies and are familiar with them.
So Adam Ransom asks, many clergy, me included, weren't brought up with the BCP. I found that I didn't receive much training in its use at college. How can the PBS encourage training for ordinands and new clergy?
Well, I think that's going to be a very significant thing as we work towards the 2030 vision. Adam, I'm grateful for your email that you sent during the presentation. Adam is in this diocese of Chichester and streaming prayer book worship now, and I didn't know about that, and that's really encouraging. We do need to work very closely indeed with all the colleges to work out what training is being offered, find out what potential there is for future training. And Adam, it may be useful if we could have a conversation at some point in greater depth about the training that you received and see how you can be involved with it in the future.
Well, I think I just need to say thank you again for that, Bradley. And well, I know from the comments and certainly from my own reaction how heartened we are by what we've heard this afternoon and what it means for the use of the Book of Common Prayer. And I'd say cautiously that it almost begins to feel as though its time has come again.